Welcome back to Legitimate Targets, everybody. I hope you're all having a great day. I've got a very special guest joining me today. We are going to be talking a lot about the EU because it's absolutely incredible, the leadership that we're witnessing in all the worst ways possible. So Wolfgang Munchau is a European specialist. He is an expert in the European Union. He is the director of European intelligence and a columnist at Unheard, a media outlet that we have discussed stories from here on this program before, as well as DL News. So, Wolfgang, thank you so much for joining me today. I want to start off by, first of all, let's talk about where the EU goes, because I don't really understand. It seems like they're tethered to this Biden era foreign policy, domestic policy. You've got Trump that is clearly trying to weaken the EU, and not to mention, obviously, EU cut off their energy supplies from Russia, and now they've cut off their trade route from Belarus through Poland. Where does the EU go? How do they develop in a sovereign manner?
Well, Jackson, thank you for having me on your show. It's a completely legitimate question, and the answer is basically it's not going anywhere. The EU was simply not prepared for what happened here, and the EU has set up a very sort of strange modus. It's not a federal union like the United States, but it's also not a bit more like a club. So it has rules, it has its own court, it even has its own parliament, but it's sort of a hybrid organization. And on important things like foreign policy, it depends on unanimity, and so you get vetoes on foreign policy, for example, by the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, and it's going to be very difficult for the EU to act jointly. And then you have much bigger issues like France and Germany pushing in different directions on military, on economic policy. So this has been the EU is not united, and member states often defined themselves in terms of their relationship with the United States, and they had good relationships with the Biden administration, generally better relationships with Democrats than with Republicans. That's been the case, I'd say, since Clinton. Didn't used to be the case under Reagan and Bush Senior, but it's certainly been the case ever since Clinton came to power. So for this entire sort of period from 1990 to 2020, so that period of globalization, Europeans were very much sort of in the democratic mold of politics. And they can't deal with Trump. When Trump imposed these tariffs, they thought we can fight the guy. They thought the financial markets would sort him out. This whole Trump always chickens out thing played very big in Europe. They always thought he would chicken out when he didn't. They misjudged American politics pretty much throughout the last 10 years. They bet on during Trump won, they bet on him being, losing the next election, which was a correct bet, but they were so sure about it that, and then they were sure about it that he would not return. And so it's basically, a string of bad bets. Germans bet on Russia before the war. Now they are turning heavily against Russia, like everyone else in Europe, over Ukraine. Europe is very strong in support for Ukraine, but Europe doesn't have a strategy for Ukraine. And the only strategy was for America to win the war. So it wasn't really it was at no point something that was so thought through and, funded. Or the only thing that I've heard recently is we'll fight for as long, or Ukraine fights for as long as it takes for Putin to get exhausted. And the reality is that we Europeans have a habit to get exhausted before other people do. So it's not going to happen. And Putin is Putin has, and the latest hope is that his economy will collapse. It's that kind of stuff that keeps on happening in Europe. We also now we want to seize his assets. He's got a 200 billion in assets, which would be a very sort of hostile act. And because we don't have the money ourselves, we take his money to fund Ukraine. But we could face legal action in foreign courts, even in our own courts, because there isn't really a legal basis for that. And it's so basically, all these sort of things, I'm sort of I used to be very pro-European myself, and still sort of in some respects I am. But what I'm seeing is lack of strategic thinking, just, gut level responses. And, when it comes to things like war, you want to have a strategy, and the strategy meaning, not just the next move, but just, the move, the move after the next one, and end game. You want to know how to, end it. You want to know, what you do when you don't win, and next steps. That's just totally absent in the European debate. It's just about who is right. Putin must not be rewarded for his aggression, and there was never sort of a sense in Europe that somebody actually has to enforce these things, and the Europeans tended to rely on the United States to do all the dirty work for them. And now that isn't happening anymore, and that's why people are in the state they are in now.
And I agree with you. I'm a firm believer that, like the United States, Europe should also, stake its civilizational ground and say we are a great power. And I just think it's been probably, like you, hijacked. And you have the elections being shut down in various countries when people are challenging the prevailing orthodoxy in Brussels, and in Germany, and I believe North Rhine-Westphalia, you had, like, I don't want to be too conspiratorial, but 7 AfD candidates that ended up dead right before these huge elections mysteriously. So it's a lot of weird stuff going on. Are people in Europe just tired of trying to fight for their sovereignty and fight against Brussels? Is there any fight left? Because if I was in Europe, I'd be pretty tuckered out at this point.
I mean, Europe has this, there's sort of a complex things that have them. There was this reliance on America, and we spent the peace dividend on welfare payments. So, and it's very difficult to roll them back once you give them. So once people become dependent on welfare payments, it's very difficult to get it back. Even in countries like the UK, which has now a very strong majority, where the government has no constitutional inhibitions, they can just do this. And they couldn't do this because their own MPs, their own parliament was not able to provide them with a majority for welfare reform. Germany has the additional problem that its economic model is collapsing. Its economic model was based on heavy industries, and it needed export surpluses. And the US was a big absorber of these export surpluses, so was China, so were other countries like the UK. And it finds that the world no longer wants to absorb these large volumes of German export surpluses. China is moving into competition with Germany. It's actually a new sort of, they call it the second China shock. And the first one was like Italy and France and the United States when all the outsourcing happened. But this particular shock affects Germany because the Chinese, have gotten very smart, and they know, they can produce not only cheap, but they can produce high quality products. As the stuff that Germans make, and arguably their cars are better. And tell this to a German that someone makes better cars, they'll hit you. But it's something, it's at least they make electric cars, and they're more likely to have the self-driving car up and running before the Germans do. The Germans haven't even started to test in public. So they are lagging behind in all the high-tech areas, and Germany hasn't, and that's true of Europe as a whole. They have really not been investing in 21st century technology in the last 3 decades. And the last big thing the Germans did was the perfection of the diesel engine. That's sort of something they did in the 80s and 90s of the last century. Really hasn't happened much since. So they're facing this multiple problem of a loss of an industrial model, nothing that replaces it, because they don't have a deep capital market that would require political unification, because the US only has a strong capital market because it is a country. It has a dollar, it has the Federal Reserve, it has the Treasury, and an incredibly deep capital market. Now we have in Europe 27 capital markets. We have 27 bond markets. We have one currency, but this currency is not backed by a single or accompanied by a single, debt instrument like the US Treasuries. So investors will do not benefit from this sort of depth of the capital markets, and our companies don't benefit from it. So the massive savings that the Europeans generate, it's still a rich part of the world. The massive savings that we generate do not actually go into innovation. They go into, we'll go into, VW by building another factory in China. And rather than hedging our risks, we're actually doubling down on our risks. So there's an awful lot of going on. This is sort of the broad economic story. And then there is the social story that this change of the model has left a lot of people, frustrated. And you saw this in America. There's been a backlash against sort of establishment policies. The election of Trump was clearly part of that. You see this in Europe too. You see a growth of parties on the right. I wouldn't say that they solved the problem. I don't think that there is much sort of free market spirit amongst them. So be careful what you wish for. The AfD, is even in many respects even more old-fashioned when it comes to industry. They want to restore the old pipelines. I mean, they're not like innovative and modern. So you will actually find once they come to power that they're actually very different from the right in the United States. But nevertheless, there is this sort of backlash against the prevailing order. And this is how politics works. Politics works different from economics. Politics works like people are unhappy. They vote for whatever they didn't vote for last time. And you saw this in Italy. Sometimes they voted on the left, then they voted on the right, then they voted for sort of a party that was neither left nor right, but opposed to pretty much everything. Now they have Giorgia Meloni of the right. She was the last one she was the one they hadn't tried, and now she's quite they quite like her, and she's certainly quite successful. Whether that same will happen with Marine Le Pen in France, it's hard to say. They might succeed, they might fail politically. But I doubt that any one of them succeeds economically. Meloni in Italy certainly does not. And Italy is, I'd say Italy is economically weak. It has a very high level of debt. It has very low dynamics, lots of bureaucracy. So there's no dynamism in it, and she really hasn't changed this. But she's kept herself off the radar screen of the bond market vigilantes. There's no one is attacking Italy, and this sort of nervousness we had in the last decade, that's all gone. So she's kind of professional in that respect, but she's also not solving problems. And frankly, in Europe, nobody is solving problems, and that's not what we do. We Europeans, we give lectures, and we like to impress other people. We have very good food, and we have beautiful places for others to see. We have museums, but we are no longer sort of leading. We're no longer the intellectual leaders as we once were. The scientific leaders that we once were, certainly the technological leaders. In my youth, Germany was a technological leader. I mean, they had the most brilliant companies, and everybody in Germany was like, we all studied mathematics and sciences, and this was the thing that Germans used to do in those days. That's no longer quite so strong, and it's you see there is a decline that's happening in Germany. It might come to the United States too. It hasn't happened yet, but it's possible. There are scenarios in which that can happen, and it might be a disease of the West in general. But there are obviously ways to reverse it, and some countries do, and some countries don't. And I think what in Europe we've seen, nobody has yet, even started.
I fully agree. I don't think that anyone in America is presenting any revolutionary ideas to compete with China on the left or the right. But one of the things I've seen in Germany in particular that's been really shocking to me recently is I see German auto factories are being bought up by China. I see this week, I think it was Germany's top steel firm. India is trying to buy it. Like, what is going on there? How is this happening? And what has been the ramification for, I guess, young Germans and young working class people? Because in China, you have record high home ownership levels, even amongst young people. In Europe, and again, the economic powerhouse, Germany, what has been the real, I guess, hit that they've faced as a result of this?
What happened with the steel company? This is ThyssenKrupp. And this is a very interesting case. Normally, the German, one of the things why Germany went so wrong is that Germany has this consensus system. The banks, the government, the industry, they're all basically together. They also control each other. There isn't, they don't work so much. While they have competition within the system, they're not told, they don't like whistleblowers. They don't like, one. You didn't see any one. I mean, Germany has 3 huge car companies, and virtually all the brands we know, like Porsche, they all belong to one of them. There wasn't one of them that did electric cars when the Chinese did. They all told each other, and the government told them that the old diesel car and the petrol cars were perfectly fine, and they didn't need to invest into this new technology, and no one did. So this consensus society, and that consensus society affected all sectors, including steel. And the main steel company, ThyssenKrupp, they got a new chairman who was looking at the figures and said, look, Germany's industrial declining. There's no way we can keep our capacity going, because steel is kind of, you're investing in capacity like a steel mill. It has a fixed output. The thing burns or it doesn't burn. It burns 24 hours a day. So your output is fixed. It's different from other, production facilities which have, flexibility. Steel is totally unflexible. So they have to fix, so many million tons a year. That he basically said we'll have to halve the capacity. There was a huge outcry in the country, but saying you can't do this, and there'll be lots of workers lose their jobs. But his analysis was that the demand for steel from Germany would be lower in the future because the country is in decline. He said so outright. And then, he prevailed with this strategy. Nobody thought he would, because, he had a lot of opposition from politicians. Some politicians were sitting in a supervisory board, which is sort of a separate board structure that big German companies have. And in steel industry, they actually have the politicians and the trade unions, they actually have 50% of the votes, so they can actually, they can actually change policy, and the supervisory board chairman is usually one of theirs, not one of the employer's side. So basically, they're kind of running the show. Is sort of very much a vestige of sort of 1960s, 1970s, corporate socialism that was quite popular in Europe, but it has sort of prevailed on the steel industry. But ThyssenKrupp, they make other things. Most of their money comes from different business. And they said, look, when we don't even want to make steel anymore, so he's going to sell it off to the highest bidder. I mean, there was at time a thought that the company would be sold to a Czech entrepreneur, a billionaire from the Czech Republic. So this is basically what happens. That you sell. It's quite possible that the car industry is, is huge in Germany. It's like but I mean, if you, it's not just the industry itself; it's the suppliers. I mean, there are millions of jobs in this industry, and they have bet on the wrong technology. And this is becoming painfully clear that on electric cars they cannot compete with the Chinese, not in price, but also not in quality. And I think that's why their crisis is different. Now, 20 years ago, they also had a crisis, but the VWs were top notch. They were great cars. You would say they're still good cars. I don't want to sort of knock any of these mechanical cars. They're still these German cars are well made. That hasn't changed, but they're not as technologically advanced as they used to be. If you compare this with a Tesla or with a BYD models from China, they have better batteries. They have the electronics is better. The software is better. The Germans are not software makers. I mean, there's the VW chairman who screams to his workforce is, "We are a software company," but nobody believes him, because this is the furthest you can be away from a software company. The whole culture. This is like a blue collar culture. It's in many ways a nice culture. I kind of I like that old stuff, but it's not a software company. This is not Silicon Valley. If you go to these countries, and they haven't really made the transition. So this is what you're seeing in German industry. So you find that the Chinese, the Indians buy up stuff that Germans can no longer, or find it no longer profitable to manage. And you'll see more and more of that happening. And I expect that more. And I think there may even be a future for the German car industry as the junior partner of the Chinese. It's better. I mean, if they want to sell their cars in Europe, at least we can make them. At least we can, take a cut in this. it's not as exciting as being the world leader yourself, but it's better than nothing. And I think I'd see more and more of that happening. So the Chinese will come in, and American investment may rise as well. And there has been some increase in American investment into Germany this year. And there's certain interest now in there's a lot of medium-sized companies where the owner, they were founded like in the 50s and 60s, where the owner no longer has hasn't got anyone in the family to pass it on to. Now, companies like these are perfect targets for private equity investment companies that might just have ideas of how to turn these companies into profitable networks, and so quite a lot of that is happening. But it means downsizing, it means fewer jobs, it means reorganization, stuff that they don't like very much. There's still positive stuff going on in Germany. It's still a country with sophisticated. People are sophisticated. People have good education, good engineers. You could do something with them. They didn't become like obsolete overnight. That isn't the case. They are also quite educated in modern tech industries. You may find some people who made some of the most important contributions to AI research come from Germany or France. It's just that Germany and France do not contribute to the industrial side of it. It's just mostly an American business and increasingly Chinese business. So there are multiple failures that are now, it's all coming together pretty much. And this is, I think, the unusual situation is that we're all that with Russia's war, with the Trump administration, with the changes in China, all of that stuff coming together in a very short time. And what looked like a very successful business model and successful economy 10 years ago is now in a very hopeless situation.
When you look at Europe today, at least as an outside observer, it kind of looks like a union that's more concerned with virtue signaling about foreign issues than actually fixing its very real, issues from within. That being said, you take into account the economic decline of some of the old vestiges of power, like Germany or, formerly the UK when it was a part of the EU, France in political turmoil right now, yet again. Do you think that there's going to be, and is there already, a shift in prioritization of power within the bloc towards countries like Poland and Nordic states who border Russia and can be utilized as leverage against Russia as they play these games of international politics?
I mean, we have been using, the west of Europe has been using the East to its advantage, like cheap labor. We should not underestimate. I mean, Poland is a big country in terms of its numbers, but in terms of its economy, it's still less than half of Germany per capita, and then the country is about less than half of the size of Germany. So one has to sort of put these countries into perspective, or the Nordic countries, very advanced, very modern, very sort of sophisticated, but kind of small, all of them. And so I think, if you look at Europe, most of it is France and Germany, basically. If you add Italy and Spain together, those four countries are kind of most of it in terms of, GDP, in terms of numbers of people. And this is the old Europe. This is where the crisis is. The new Europe is healthier, but it's a catch-up story. They're catching up, and they're also dependency story. So the Polish companies are very dependent on Germany. So it's an open question of whether Poland can actually. If Germany's business model isn't working anymore, then over time the Polish model will also not work. So they need to kind of reinvent themselves. Now, I have a reasonable confidence that they might manage to do that. They are more flexible. They don't have the welfare system. They don't have these structural rigidities that we have in Western Europe. But the idea that Eastern Europe could sort of start taking a lead, this is not happening. The EU is pretty rigid in the way it is organized. Now, you mentioned the virtue signaling. I see exactly the same problem. They talk about things, and they talk about what they don't like in other countries, and but they're not solving their own problems, and that is fundamentally an issue. It's typical example is the European Commission. I mean, they started the single market, which started off as a very sort of exciting project to create a single market. They kind of stopped halfway. Now, it's not the European Commission's fault, because there were member states like France that didn't want this, but services are basically, most of the services are excluded from it. Then they had the single currency, but that was never, as we discussed before, never accompanied with a fiscal union and a political union. Then they had the Green Deal, this environmental program, which was, unfortunately only based on targets, not on innovation. Now they're stopping this halfway through. So there's a whole list of things that they started and didn't finish. Now they're going into military. Now Now we hear from the European Commission that Ukraine is the most important issue for Europe, and people get offended when I say, no, Ukraine is not your most important issue. The fact is that you're weak. The fact that you're declining. The fact that you're not doing anything about it, that is the most important issue. If you were strong, you would also be able to have a more decisive policy on Ukraine. But the last thing Ukraine needs is a weak Europe. Because a weak Europe, I mean, we're saying we support Ukraine for as long as it takes. There's not a single West European country that has budget allocations for that. Mm-hmm. And the only way for Western European countries to support Ukraine effectively would be to actually take the money. But they haven't thought through the consequences of the Russian money. They haven't thought completely of what it would mean, and also the escalation in the war. It's not like Russia would then stop. Russia has China as a supporter. This is one of the consequences of the way the West handled the war in Ukraine. It's brought Russia, China, and North Korea closer together. And I would think this is a massive global policy failure. I think this has happened it started with the Biden administration, when they imposed very heavy sanctions on China, these semiconductor sanctions. They have not worked. China, they have actually done what I expected they would do. They turned China into a powerhouse of global semiconductor manufacturing. They are now even refusing to buy NVIDIA chips, which is unheard of. If you told someone the story 2 or 3 years ago, and that shows you how far it goes. Especially in the U.S. Foreign policy establishment, people were in denial, and many people still are in denial over the fact that China and Russia are forming a strategic relationship. So these have been massive policy failures. So we've created a very powerful adversary in the sort of new axis of the East Eurasian continent. And these axes, formed as India is it's not really part of anybody's team, but they're certainly playing in the other team when it suits them. Pakistan and Saudi Arabia have just formed a big strategic alliance, and given Pakistan's relationship with China, that increases China's influence in the Middle East. So we are seeing significant geopolitical, networks being established on the Eurasian continent by China. The idea that Russia, for China, it is useful for Russia to fight this war because it keeps everyone engaged and no one focuses on Taiwan, and that's something the Chinese have admitted that themselves, that they are supporting Russia with. They're no longer hiding the fact that they're supplying Russia with dual-use goods, and in a war we know what dual-use goods mean in a war. There are military goods. And China and Russia have deepened their commercial relationships, and China will also supply Russia with funds if needed. So the idea that we can smoke Putin out, that we can basically outspend him, when we have such weak political systems with majorities and a far right rising everywhere and depriving existing governments of their majorities, is delusional. I have no other words. I mean, I'm happy to express policy disagreements, but this is delusional. This is not about, this is not something we can conceivably win. But this is the kind of strategy that people pursue when they only think one step ahead at the time. And there is virtually no culture in Europe for people to actually, think things through, think on the bigger picture, actually, because there's always America in the back. And the Americans did all the strategic thinking. And we could just, place demands, and we could just play the moral high ground and do the virtual signaling, as you put it. And that's basically, what what we were rather good at, and now we have to learn that we actually have to think for ourselves, and haven't done it yet. And that's sort of, we're in this sort of in the middle place. We might fail. There's a possibility of significant failure. I no longer call this as sort of a sort of an outside chance or a sort of a tail risk. I think there are some seriously bad outcomes possible. This is not my mainstream scenario. We have hard to forecast the future, but we could have a war with Russia. That is quite possible. Just requires a few mistakes, and suddenly we have a war. United States will probably not enter this war, so it'll be us versus the Russians. Now it's a hopeless situation, and I would strongly recommend the Europeans not to do that, because we are not equipped for this. And even if we invest a little bit more, which we are now doing, and this is a good thing, we lack the capabilities in electronic warfare. We lack the satellite technology. Germans are good at building tanks, but the wars of the 21st centuries are not decided by the quality of your tanks, but by your electronic surveillance system, drones, and modern technology, where we are also lagging behind, and which we would have to buy from the United States. So again, another dependency. So it's this would require some smart strategic acting, which unfortunately I don't see.
Well, hopefully we have some people that start thinking in Brussels sometime soon. Wolfgang, thank you so much for joining me today. Extremely insightful. And I hope nothing but the best for Europe. But I do agree, it's a very troubling situation right now. So where's the best place for people to follow along if they want to stay up to date with all of your analysis moving forward?
Well, I have my own service called Euro Intelligence. You can find it on Substack. We have our own website, eurointelligence.com. We write about the European, what I'm talking about. This is basically, you get bigger versions, more detailed versions on each of the countries, on finance, economics. Eurointelligence.com is the way to go.
Very good. Thank you so much for joining me.
Jackson, thank you very much for having me.